Tim with Life Center Ministries. Today we're going to be looking at Acts chapter 23, reading from the NASB version. There will be donation info posted on the screen briefly for those who are interested and donating to Life Center Ministries. And also, please like, subscribe, share, comment, and all of that. It helps. Picking up in verse 1. So now we have Paul here. We finished off in Acts 22, and the Roman commander, to his credit, he's trying to get to the bottom of the situation with Paul. Why are they so upset with Paul? There's a language barrier. He doesn't understand exactly what's going on. So he calls the Sanhedrin together and arranges this meeting between for the Sanhedrin for Paul to sit in front of them and in hopes of kind of getting to the bottom of the issue. So 23:1, Paul before the council. Now, looking intently at the council, Paul said, "Brothers, I have lived my life with an entirely good conscience before God up to this day." But the high priest Ananias commanded those standing beside him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Do you sit to try me according to the law, and in violation of the law, order me to be struck?" But those present said, "Are you insulting God's high priest?" And Paul said, "I was not aware, brothers, that he is the high priest, for it is written, 'You shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people.'" So in verse 1, it says, Paul looked intently. It's also translated earnestly in a couple other versions. And the Greek word here is atenizo or atenizo, and it literally means to look intently with a fixed gaze, to fix your eyes upon. It implies profound seriousness and focus on what. So he's picture how he's saying what he's saying, and then he addresses them as brothers rather than rulers or elders or some other lofty term. He's setting himself on equal footing here with them. So he's dead focused and he addresses them as equals. And and then he tells them that he's essentially been living in accordance with God's will. He declares this, that he's had an entirely good conscience before God. And this claim of good conscience offends the high priest for some reason. And Ananias orders him to be struck in the mouth, punched in the mouth, slapped in the face, something to that effect. And now we know Ananias was a Sadducee, and he was the high priest from around 48 AD to 58 AD, and this would be right at the end of his term, right at the end, because we are, most scholars believe, right at 58 AD here, the end of 58 AD. So this would be the end here, close to the end. And we know he was a corrupt man, Ananias. Josephus tells us that he actually stole tithe money and kept it for himself. And we also know that he had a history of violence, using violence and assassinations to further his interest. And so, in Jewish law, because as we go through this, so Jewish law said it was illegal to strike the cheek of a Jewish man. And then Paul kind of calls him out on that and says, "God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall." And now Josephus also tells us regarding this that around 8 years later, that in the first Jewish Roman war, that Ananias was actually killed, and some say he was hunted down and killed by his own people. So his day was coming, and in violation of the law, there's a reference here to Deuteronomy. I'll put this on the screen. Deuteronomy 25, 1 and 2. It says, if there's a dispute between people and they go to court and the judges decide their case and they declare the righteous innocent and pronounce the wicked guilty, then it shall be, if the wicked person deserves to be beaten, the judge shall then make him lie down and have him beaten in his presence with a number of lashes according to his wrongful act. And so Paul is innocent here. He's guilty. He's not been convicted. I mean, he's not guilty. He's not been convicted of anything, and only a man found guilty can be beaten. And then we see in verse 4 that Paul apologizes here, and he cites Exodus 22:28 for reference. Put that up. It says, "You shall not curse God nor curse a ruler of your people." So Paul apologizes here for what he's done, and then it begs the question here, did Paul really not know that he was the high priest? Did Paul really, was he really unaware? I mean, come on. Paul was, most believe, a former member of the Sanhedrin himself. So he would know how this works, right? He would know how this goes down, who's speaking to him. But now keep in mind, Paul had been away from this well over 20 years since he had been a member of the Sanhedrin, or part of the council in any way, shape, or form. And then some would speculate here that it was Paul's poor eyesight, and that he simply couldn't see who he was talking to. And I'll bring up a couple references that people point to with that. Galatians 4, verse 14. It says, "You did not despise that which was a trial to you in my bodily condition, nor express contempt, but you have received me as an angel of God," angel just being messenger there, as Christ Jesus himself. Verse 15, "Where then is that sense of blessing you had? For I testify about you that if possible, you would have torn out your eyes and given them to me." Another reference people use here is Galatians 6, verse 11, when he says, "See with the large letters I have written to you with my own hand." And another reference point people would use, I'm not going to pull it up, is the 2 Corinthians 12:7 reference of the thorn in the flesh that most people know very well. And others speculate here that it was just Paul being sarcastic, not necessarily lying, but being sarcastic, as if to say a real high priest wouldn't act this way. Like, as if, oh, you're the high priest. I didn't think a high priest would act like this. So it could have been some, it could have been any of those, could have been some of both, but it definitely begs that question, like how would Paul not know? That would be my first school of thought on that. Picking up in verse 6, "But Paul, perceiving that one group were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, began crying out in the council, 'Brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. I am on trial for the hope and resurrection of the dead.' When he said this, a dissension occurred between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor an angel, nor a spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. And a great uproar occurred, and some of the scribes of the Pharisaic party stood up and started arguing heatedly, saying, 'We find nothing wrong with this man. So suppose a spirit or an angel has spoken to him.' Verse 10, "And when a great dissension occurred, the commander was afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them, and he ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks." So this is a very strategic move here by Paul. In a very strategic move, he turns the attention off of himself to an extremely divisive issue between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And so infighting breaks out between these two groups, and Paul is removed from the conflict by the Roman commander. And Paul picks the right issue here, and he frames it in the right terms, and he immediately gains the Pharisees as an ally, as we see. And now the Sanhedrin would be made up of 70 members plus the high priest, so it would be 71. And the exact number of Pharisees and Sadducees varied, but the Pharisees were always the minority, sometimes a large minority, sometimes a small minority, but they were always a minority. However, despite always being the minority group, the Pharisees carried a lot of weight because they had a much greater influence over the Jewish population as a whole. So, in spite of the smaller numbers, they carried more weight because the people would be more on their side. And again, then we see the Roman commander comes in here and gets Paul out of this. And now the Roman commander, if you've read or listened to Acts 22 recently, we know that he has an obligation to protect this interesting Roman citizen, Paul, and especially because he's already violated his rights, which we just read about in Acts 22. So he has an obligation to make sure Paul is safe and he comes out of this alive because of his Roman citizenship. Um, Picking up at verse 11, "But on the following night the Lord stood near him, and he said, 'Be courageous, for as you have testified to the truth about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify in Rome also.'" So in this, I have a lot here in this one verse, but So the Lord stands with him, meets him in his jail cell, and says, "Be courageous." And some translate this, "Be encouraged." And the King James here, I think, is the most accurate. In this case, it says, "Be of good cheer." And so now picture this is somewhat speculation, but Paul was potentially a bit discouraged here. Maybe he felt like he missed out on an opportunity to maybe deliver a sermon to the Sanhedrin, maybe to use Old Testament references onto how Jesus was the Messiah, or something like that. Maybe he missed out on this opportunity, and you could agree that his reaction, you could argue, I guess, that his reaction to being punched in the face or slapped in the mouth, or whatever it was, potentially spoiled an opportunity here. So his poor impulse reaction to that maybe spoiled an opportunity of him to say something else. But however, if it was a mistake, if it wasn't a mistake, it's debatable. The Lord stands with him here, and God shows up to bring him comfort. And now we see the Lord speaking to Paul in various places. He spoke to Paul on the road to Damascus when he was on the way to kill Christians. When, after his conversion, he goes back to Jerusalem, and the Lord speaks to Paul in the temple. And now the Lord speaks to Paul in the jail cell. So God meets us where we are. He speaks to us where we are. And be of good cheer here. That phrase that I talked about to begin this segment is the Greek word tharseo, and it's used four other times in the New Testament other than here. And they were all by Jesus, and they were all in situations where circumstances had brought discouragement to people. And it's Matthew 9:2, Matthew 9:22, Matthew 14:27, and John 16:33, and then again here in Acts 23:11. So four other times, five total times that this phrase is used as an encouragement to bring comfort to Paul. Uh, or this time to Paul, the other four references to others, but same phrasing. And then also here in this verse, we see Paul receives his next mission. That's Rome. And God is telling Paul that he's not done with him here, that there's more for him to do. It's not over. And in spite of the situation, in spite of the circumstances, in spite of the discouragement, it's not over. And I'm pretty sure there's probably somebody watching this that needs to hear that. I've needed to hear this at times. In spite of the circumstances that are going on in your life right now, in spite of the recent past, and in spite of whatever failures you think you've had, God is still with you, and it's not over, and there's more for you to do. And that's what's happening here with Paul. And then we also know Paul desired to go to Rome. We read in Acts 19, I'll pull this up, Acts 19:21. He says, "Now after these things were finished, Paul resolved in the Spirit to go to Jerusalem after he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia, saying, After I have been there, I must also see Rome." And then again in Romans 1:13, he says, I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that often I have planned to come to you and have been prevented so far, so that I may obtain some fruit among you also, just as among the rest of the Gentiles. So there's two different places where he references his desire or his willingness or wanting to go to Rome. And I'll bring up one more reference here in Psalm 37:4, where it says, "Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart." And I'll go on and read 5 and 6 here. "Commit your way to the Lord, trust also in him, and he will do it. He will bring out your righteousness as the light and your judgment as the noonday." It goes on to say, "Rest in the Lord and wait patiently on him," and so on. But God will give us the desires of our heart. It's okay to have desires in accordance with God's will. Picking up in verse 12. A conspiracy to kill Paul. When it was day, the Jews formed a conspiracy and put themselves under an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who formed this plot. They came to the chief priests and the elders and said, "We have put ourselves under an oath to taste nothing until we have killed Paul. Now therefore you and the council notify the commander to bring him down to you, as though you were going to investigate his case more thoroughly. And as for us, We are ready to kill him before he comes near the place. And so this could have possibly been one of two groups. You have the Zealots, and then you have this group called the Sicarii. And the Sicarii was a more extreme, radical subgroup of the Zealots. And Sicarii comes from the Latin word for dagger. And so these sometimes would be called daggermen. And they make this high level commitment here that no food or drink until we succeed in this mission to kill Paul. And they form a plot, they bring it to the Sanhedrin, and they're on the same page here. And picking up in verse 16. But the son of Paul's sister heard about their ambush, and he came and entered the barracks, and he told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions to himself and said, "Take this young man to the commander, for he has something to report to him." So he took him and led him to the commander and said, "Paul the prisoner called me over to him and asked me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you." Verse 19. The commander took him by the hand and, stepping aside, began to inquire of him privately, "What is it that you have to report to me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down tomorrow to the council, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more thoroughly about him. So do not listen to them, for more than 40 of them are in hiding to ambush him, and these men have put themselves under an oath not to eat or drink until they kill him, and now they are ready and waiting for assurance from you." Verse 22. Then the commander let the young man go, instructing him, "Tell no one that you have notified me of these things." So we see here Paul has a nephew. Like, where did this come from? We didn't know that Paul had a nephew. But Paul, in church tradition, tells us a little bit about his sister and potentially his brothers, cousins. There's some church tradition out there now. As far as his nephew, we don't know exactly who it is. We do see in the text here, he's a young man. He needed to be kind of told what to do. He didn't have the presence of mind or the knowledge to go straight to the Roman commander, so he goes to Paul. Um, and then we see the Roman commander here he takes him by the hand. So all of this looks like it would be a young man, 12, 13, 14, potentially 15 years old, maybe somewhere in that range. Some speculate, I'm not going to get too far into this, some speculate this young man was Julius Archelaus. There's really not much there. Some also speculate that in Romans 16:11, when Paul references the Herodian kinsman, that this was his nephew he was referencing, who was potentially Julius Archelaus. And it was common at this time for family and friends to bring prisoners or those in custody to bring them food. And in fact, it's documented that prisoners often starved, sometimes to death, if no friends or family brought them any food. So it would not be uncommon for this young man to come in and be able to see Paul. And now we don't know how this Paul's young nephew here heard about the plot, but we can be sure that it's no coincidence that God arranged this. God is always working in unseen ways. Just because something we can't see it doesn't mean it's not happening. We have limited, very, very, very limited perspective. God sees everything, and we have to trust that. So God positioned Paul's nephew at the right place at the right time to hear exactly what he needed to hear. And picking up in verse 23, Paul moved to Caesarea, and he called him two of the centurions and said, "Get 200 soldiers ready by the third hour of the night to proceed to Caesarea with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen." They were also to provide mounts to put Paul on and bring him safely to Felix the governor. And he wrote a letter with the following content. Verse 26, Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. When this man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them, I came up to them with the troops and rescued him, after learning that he was a Roman. And wanting to ascertain the basis for the charges they were bringing against him, I brought him down to their council. And I found that he was being accused regarding questions in their law, but was not charged with anything deserving death or imprisonment. When I was informed that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, also instructing his accusers to bring charges against him before you. So this is the late night ride of the revered Paul. In the third hour, which would be around 9 p.m., The Claudius Lysias here clearly takes this plot seriously. He writes this letter and he orders 472 men to escort Paul out of the city. So he is doing all he can to ensure his safety. And again, I mean, maybe there's a bit of a guilty conscience there for already violating Paul's rights back in Acts 22. We don't know. We can speculate if that came into play or not. And so he gathers 472 men to escort him to Governor Felix in Caesarea. Picking up in 31, so the soldiers, in accordance with their orders, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. Verse 32, but on the next day they let the horsemen go on with him, and they returned to the barracks. When these horsemen had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. Now, when he had read it, he also asked from what province Paul was. And when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive as well, giving orders for Paul to be kept in Herod's praetorium. So they take off at late into the night and at Antipatris, which is about 25 miles away. 200 of the soldiers head back home. And from what I understand, from here on out, it was mostly a Gentile population. It was mostly inhabited by Gentiles. So the thought is that from here on out, Paul would be safe. And then they travel another 26 to 28 miles, depending on what you read, to Caesarea from Antipatris. And they present Paul along with this letter to Governor Felix. So the plot here of the 40 plus daggermen or assassins had failed. And to my knowledge, there's no word on if they ever ate again or when they ate again. I'm not sure about that. Verse 34, so when hearing that Paul is from Cilicia, Governor Felix here knows that he is indeed responsible to hear this case and orders him to be kept at Herod's Praetorium. So Herod's Praetorium was one of two large palaces built by Herod the Great. One was built in Jerusalem and one was built here in the harbor city of Caesarea. And it served as an official residence for the Roman governors and also as a judgment hall for trials like this. And it's not exactly known what kind of accommodations uh, Paul had here, but a lot of people, many scholars believe that because Paul was a Roman citizen and he spoke Greek and he was not guilty of any crime, that it was probably very lenient. He was safe there, and he most likely had a fairly good amount of freedom despite being in custody. And unfortunately for Paul, this would begin a 2 year period of confinement in Caesarea before he was taken on to Rome. And that's all we have for Acts 23. Thank you so much for watching. There will be donation info posted for Life Center Ministries. And please like, subscribe, comment, share. And thank you for watching. God bless.